All right. Hey, thanks for joining us. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk. We no Regan today. Regan had something come up, and so she's not able to join us today. But I do have a guest lined up, and this is a guest who's been on my show. In fact, she was on my other show just a few days ago. So I'm going to rely on her as a guest co-host for today. So let me introduce Janene Yazzie, Dene from Navajo territory. Janene, welcome to this show, which is different than my last show. This is Let's Talk on WBAI. So welcome to Let's Talk.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and to have my debut as a semi co-host.
There you go, in New York City. All right. Look, you did join me on my Let's Talk Native show a couple of days ago, and we one of the things that disturbed me, and one of the reasons I almost desperately reached out to you, I wanted to have a conversation that could somehow balance out the fact that the Navajo vice president was endorsing and speaking at the Republican National Convention. And I just wanted to have a Navajo or a Dene voice out there to say, look, this isn't what everybody feels, right? So that's part of what I wanted to have you on my show for a couple of days ago. I don't want to reiterate all that. Look, if anybody's interested, again, my show is a podcast. You can go to my Let's Talk Native show, my last Let's Talk Native show, and hear that conversation. I don't want to avoid talking about it, but I actually want to go a little further than just the idea that you have Native people willing to step up and not just endorse Trump, but Native leadership do that and do it at some of the highest levels. I will say, and this doesn't balance it out. To me, this is actually increases the problem that I want to talk about. The Navajo president, Jonathan Nez, actually spoke at the DNC convention, and this was Myron Leiser, the vice president, speaking at the RNC convention. It just there's and I guess that kind of gets to my point about how much Native people are lured into the politics of the United States, and when I think about the millions, and I don't mean just tens of millions, it's probably hundreds of millions of dollars that's spent on a yearly basis from territories all over the U.S. and Canada, for that matter, getting sucked into the politics of their colonial overlords. Literally, the federal governments, the state governments, the provincial governments. There's money spent on campaigns, and just like as evidence with what the Navajo Nation has done here, they don't even just endorse one party that's supposed to have their back. They throw money at both of them so they can somehow buy access. It's like there's this notion that they have to pay to play with the federal government. So I want to kind of have that conversation a little bit more with you, if you don't mind.
No, absolutely. It's an important conversation. I think that gets to the root of the problems and challenges with participating in the electoral system. So, very timely conversation to have.
Well, and the reason I want to have this conversation more broadly is because it's not just the Navajo Nation. Every Native territory is spending millions of dollars with lobbying firms, with consultants, with lawyers, with even their participation in some of these larger organizations like NCAI, the National Congress of the American Indian, the USET, which is the United Southern Tribe. I don't know, can't remember what it all means, but anyway, all these other organizations. And of course, within that, there are trade organizations like the National Indian Gaming Association, the NIGA. There are all these organizations that, again, are drawing millions of dollars from territories that don't really have it to give. I mean, let's be clear here. We have territories that have the highest levels of poverty than any other places or peoples within in the continent, and so when we talk about this money, I know the immediate thought that some people may have is, well, they're all rich gaming tribes that can spend millions of dollars. No, they aren't. And I think this is the part of the problem and part of the conversation that I think we need to have.
No, absolutely. And the participation in this process, or this buying of elections and politicians, has not even really led to any real benefits for us, since this practice has been started. But I'm sure we'll go into that as we delve into this discussion.
Well, and that it's a really good point, and part of the reason for that is that although these millions of dollars may be a lot for people like us who are struggling with some of this poverty, when you compare the millions of dollars that are being spent, sometimes from territory to territory, and then and a much larger number when you could put us all together, it still pales by comparison to what some of these industries are paying for. So the very thing that we're trying to favor, that we're trying to buy, we're not spending as much money as the adversaries are spending. So yeah, we do this for some sort of access, but that access never turns into meaningful policy that affects change. Look, even this BS token gesture that Trump made towards missing and murdered Indigenous women. He just threw more money at the Justice Department. He just increased the staffing of white people, essentially. No real meaningful change to go after cold cases, or or really give any meaningful resource. By the time you divide the several $1 million he threw at this thing up to all of the the Justice Department offices, it's not even enough for a staff person.
Absolutely. And it just infuriates me that this keeps being used as a talking point for one of the great successes of this administration and the advancement that has been made on behalf of Indigenous peoples under his leadership. When you look at it, it's like a useless symbolic action that has led to nothing. No real systemic changes, no real federal resources to go to the root of, and help address the resource gaps that would actually enable us to tackle this issue in a meaningful way. And we don't need those types of empty symbolic gestures. Like they're meant to placate and not actually address the issues at hand.
Right. I mean, and there's so much that when there is something done, I mean, it's like Lizer standing up at the RNC convention and praising Trump for money being released, released to native territories, the $8 billion. That was hard fought for, and they had to sue the administration, the Trump administration, to get the money, because they were going to send most of that money to these corporations, these native corporations, mostly in Alaska, that are more tied to the oil industry. They weren't even going to, the money wasn't even going to come. It was going to be swallowed up, not by quote unquote federally recognized tribes, but by corporations that are oftentimes not really looking out for the best interests of Native people.
Yeah, and that's what happened with all of the stimulus funds from the beginning that were created or slated for so-called COVID relief and response. Like, the majority of those funds never actually made it to the people it's supposed to help. It only went to the corporations, especially those that already had ties with this administration. And that was like the playbook that was being enacted with this so-called stimulus package for Indian country. And it's just disgusting how that selective memory can be used to outright mislead constituents. And Vice President Lizer has an obligation to tell his constituents the truth and to represent the truth, especially on the national stage, in an appropriate manner. And he didn't do that. He completely misrepresented what happened, what the position of our peoples are, and the impact that all of those games that were being played by this administration and the challenges that have been created in the actual use of the CARES Act, and the lag that's created in getting vital life-saving supplies, materials, and resources to protect our people on the ground.
Well, and again, when you consider the fact that we were left out completely in any conversation about getting PPE and testing and that kind of stuff in the very beginning, it's absurd that anybody's going to heap praise on this administration for the handling, any aspect of the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Look, the United States crossed over the 6 million confirmed cases mark yesterday, which really means even the CDC is probably saying that's probably tenfold. It's probably 60 million, but that's still leaving 270 million Americans. Even if you restrict yourself to this notion of 60 million infections that are vulnerable. There's been over 185,000 deaths. I mean, the reality is the United States will reach 200 million, or I'm sorry, 200,000 deaths by mid-September, and no other country is even really close to those numbers. So when you hear anybody, least of all somebody from Navajo territory that has been borne a large brunt of this thing, it's just frustrating to even hear this stuff. That's why I wanted to address the RNC speech, but again, I think we have to almost take this thing back a little bit, because it isn't just the RNC. Obviously, like I said, Jonathan Nez spoke at the DNC convention. But even when you go back historically, when I talk about the millions of dollars, I mean, I think about even the Obama administration when he claims to wanted to have the sit down with tribals, tribal leaders. There was literally millions of dollars spent for people to go to Washington, D.C., spend and have a 10-minute photo op with President Obama in front of the Christmas tree at the White House. I mean, we have other priorities, that we should be addressing rather than getting photo ops with any president of any party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's highly disrespectful to the severity of the issues that our nations face, the struggles that we're engaged in, particularly the struggles that are a result of direct federal policy and regulatory authorities constantly impeding the exercise of sovereignty in our lands. To think that this is a way to improve relationships with the First Nation, with our indigenous peoples of this land, is by inviting them for photo ops and shaking hands. And literally, that's kind of what I see as being the most. I guess what justifies Vice President Weiser's just adoration of Trump, and the only thing in my mind that can be behind his belief that this administration has done anything of significance for Indigenous peoples is because he has personally met with him several times, and him and his wife, and that type of individualized sort of response to this administration and to the politics at large is not the type of leadership that we need for our communities and for our nations. And it should have been very clear when he made that presentation to the RNC that is his personal position as someone who has his own ideology, his own political leanings, instead of speaking on behalf of not only the Navajo Nation, but he also, and a lot of his comments was seeming to try to speak on behalf of all of the tribes in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where it gets frustrating, because, look, you and I talked about this the other day, but there's little question that the assimilation policies of the United States have had a dramatic effect on Native people, and it's not even just from a governmental standpoint. The churches. I mean, we talked about in previous shows. You and I've talked about the impact that the churches have played, even in the spread of COVID-19 within Navajo territory. But in general, it has skewed our ability to properly, or to understand our relationship with the United States, and so we end up being almost sycophantic, and part of that comes out of the role that the churches have played. Look, I think that the Choctaw Nation, and I regret having to say this because Regan's not available to talk about, but the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma literally passed a resolution last year where they declared that the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma was a Christian nation. I mean, it's like, how do you have the right to even say that on behalf of even regardless of what percentage of your population has succumbed to to abandoning whatever native culture or ceremony or belief systems existed for these Christian beliefs, but to say that again piles you into the evangelical right category and all of that.
Absolutely. I didn't even know about this. That is astounding, but sadly not surprising. I know similar arguments have been made with our own tribal government, especially when it's come to debates around legalizing same-sex marriage in our communities. And it also comes up in a lot of ways, not only in policy making, but in just how solutions and projects, and as I've shared earlier or other times with you on your show, how relief efforts are structured and who's invited and allowed to come in and partner with the tribal government. And yeah, I absolutely agree. There's no place for this. Like how dare our leaders take positions like that, knowing full well the problematic history of religious colonization and the impacts that that's had on our communities.
Yeah, I mean, when you can think about residential schools, residential schools are a perfect example of this really ugly relationship between the not just states but federal governments and various denominations of the church, because they were the ones who operated these residential schools that, by almost all accounts, were just institutions of torture. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they their policy, which was clearly to kill the Indian, to save the man, was geared towards punishing Native children for attempting to cling on to any aspects of their identity. And what those punishments went beyond just punishment. I mean, there was sexual abuse, there was physical abuse, psychological abuse, there was the things that they did, literally changing their names and changing their appearance by chopping off their hair, and all of that stuff. And of course, for me, one of the ironies of that whole 100-year, century-long policy of residential schools is that is the exact same time frame that white kids were adopting, or white people were adopting Native emblems and symbols for mascots in their schools. So little white kids could play Indian, while Native kids were literally being killed. I mean, abused to the point of death, and of course that death was also attributed to things like neglect. Healthcare neglect. I mean, at some point on the Canadian side, the newspapers were literally making it clear. It was obvious in the newspapers that the mortality rate in some of these schools was high or over 50% mortality rate at residential schools because of tuberculosis. And there were already kind of known protocols for what you do to isolate and quarantine people with tuberculosis, but it was almost like the Tuskegee experiment. Let's see what happens. Let's see how it runs through a Native population of children. And this has been our experience with that relationship between church and government on the U.S. and the Canadian side. So you're right. It is something that is really, really disturbing. And look, we see it play out, especially when we see so-called leadership trying to pander to the federal government. I mean, there's often a Christian overtone even to that pandering.
No, absolutely. And, it does get complicated when it comes to how people politically engage, both in mainstream politics, but also in tribal politics. And I really feel, because I have in my own family people who ascribe to different denominations and whatnot. And some people are very good examples of what it would mean to ascribe to your own religious belief and values without imposing that on others, or carrying on the problematic legacy that it has had in our communities with, really demonizing our cultural beliefs and our traditional knowledge keepers and knowledge holders. But until we can reconcile it with like the full gravity of the truth of the horrors of what these religious institutions have brought into our communities, and until we can get appropriate reconciliation measures in place, and that will look different depending on the impacts to the different communities and the different nations. But in a lot of places, it's going to look like giving our land back. Like, these churches came in and were established these boarding schools, established these facilities, and took prime agricultural lands and water resources and have held monopoly on them ever since. And so, like, if we are to move forward, it's about addressing the facts of the history, the impacts on our people, and really creating mechanisms for redistribution of the resources that they've monopolized over time in our communities, that keep us beholden to these institutions because they're in the prime locations where they can produce food and control water resources for a lot of communities.
Well, and just to again address that a little more, just so people understand, because I know that there are people who still don't understand what the whole residential school thing was. But these residential schools were not just a little white schoolhouse on a prairie. I mean, these were large land holdings that included putting native children in to work the fields to generate revenue with agricultural products and these weren't just a schoolhouse. These were entire communities where there were white staff, mostly religious white staff, were barking out the orders and the regiments that native kids had to follow. And so when you explain the landholdings issue, this isn't just the footprint of a schoolhouse. These oftentimes were acres and acres of prime agricultural lands. And the crazy part is, in spite of the agricultural nature of the work that was imposed upon these kids, the kids were oftentimes malnourished. I mean, it's frustrating at every level.
Absolutely. And it still has like real tangible impacts in how resources are distributed to nations today. For example, we recently heard about a partnership between the Mormon Church, our chapter of the Mormon Church, and USDA that has led to millions of dollars being given to the Mormon Church for the purchase of livestock, sheep, and agricultural products, which they are then redistributing to our tribal communities on the Navajo Nation as a form of relief effort. When in reality, we don't need these actors to be the third party and the liaison to getting these resources to our communities, because what happens is that the people controlling the redistribution of these resources are now requiring their volunteers and the recipients of this aid that is paid for by the federal government to convert to Mormonism. And these types of things are still being carried out to this day. And that's why we cannot let go of the legacy of injustice. We cannot just forgive and forget. These must be confronted face value and dismantled in terms of especially because of the ways that this perpetuates systemic inequality and oppression and I don't know what the word would be. I'm trying to grasp for it. The systemic oppression that's being carried out in our communities by these institutions.
Well, and again, just this idea of bureaucracy that is essentially manufactured where it doesn't need to be, and by putting in again more and more people within the chain of custody of resources, whether it's dollars or whether it's land or whatever. I mean, it's even interesting when going back to the CARES Act funding. Not only did a significant amount of the money that was supposed to be earmarked for native territories get swallowed up, not by quote unquote tribal governments, but by native corporations, but there was also a lot of noise being made about how much churches had received in CARES Act funding. And I gotta wonder that when you look at within native territories, how much did some of these religious organizations within native territories get either their own portion of some of these funds and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's disturbing on a bunch of levels, but again, this problem that exists within our territories is not just something unique to today and the Trump administration. We can go back historically and find out time after time after time. Look, John F. Kennedy literally sided with the people of Pittsburgh, I guess you'd have to say, when he decided to go forward with the Kinzua Dam, which condemned 10,000 acres of Seneca land. And apologized for it later, but the reason he had done it was because of his own political aspirations. He needed to win Pennsylvania to beat Nixon at the time, and so we become a casualty. And it doesn't matter how much we try to endear ourselves to the Democrats or the Republicans. Like I said, I feel like I always had to remind people that when Barack Obama was president, he did this historic visit to native territory. Turns out the territory that he went to, which was Standing Rock, is his senior policy advisor who's Jody Archambault Gillette, was Standing Rock Sioux. If anybody already had access to the President of the United States, it would have been Standing Rock through Jody Gillette. Her brother happened to be Dave Archambault, who was the tribal chairman or president or whatever their titles were out there. And so he goes out there, does this, this event at Flag Day, kissing babies all in red, white, and blue and that kind of thing. More flags than you'd see at a Iowa 4th of July parade. And then makes this speech quoting Sitting Bull, talking about building something for the future of the children. And what comes out of all that? The Dakota Access Pipeline, which turned out to be one of the biggest, acts of resistance that Native people have had, in recent memory. And that's all the Obama administration. While he is pandering to again tribal leadership, and tribal leadership is pandering back to him.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's infuriating that these connections were only being made in real time by a lot of the younger advocates that were responsible for starting the camps at Standing Rock, and trying to call both tribal leadership as well as elected representatives at the state and federal level into account. I think they actually referenced that particular event to be like, to call Obama into account and be like, you came here to kiss our babies and talk to our youth. Well, we need you to stand beside us. And I don't think I'll ever forgive that administration, because it was under their watch that the dogs were set on our relatives at Standing Rock, that the tanks arrived, that the water canyons were deployed. And Trump came in, he fast tracked DAPL, but a lot of the most egregious crimes in the militarized response and the use of so-called non-lethal weapons that are banned by international law against unarmed, peaceful protesters and land rights defenders and human rights defenders at Standing Rock, it was all the responsibility of the Obama administration.
Well, and it's almost like the standard now has been set by what the people who were opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline experience. And so now the idea of these pepper spray canisters that look the size of fire extinguishers, just coating people's faces with this pepper spray. Some of the and many of these chemicals are actually banned, according to the Geneva Convention for weapons of war. And yet this is what's being used on protesters. And look, even the Democrats want to stand up and cite their law and order credentials and want to condemn some of the actions that are taking place as a result of these protests. But you know what? I can't condemn rioting. I can't, and I can't condemn the painting of walls and the toppling of statues, or frankly even the destruction of some of these buildings, because we've been saying this stuff for decades, and nobody's heard a goddamn thing. I mean, when we talk about the disproportionate use of force against people of color, it's real easy for people to forget that Native people are still experience a higher death by cop rate than any other people in the United States. It's just that our numbers are so small, the total numbers seem small, but we are still experiencing death by cop at a higher rate in almost every age category, except for one, where blacks from 16 to 21, I think, or 22, have a higher death by cop rate than Native people do. This all directly contributes to missing and murdered Indigenous women, the abject poverty of our territories, all of it. It's all connected.
Absolutely. And this is, I think, what speaks further to why it makes no sense for us to be participating and putting what little tribal resources we have available to us towards this charade that is carried out between the two political parties that never address any of these issues
and never address it substantively. And that's sometimes we get paid some lip service and that kind of thing. Look, Janene, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break. Reggie will take us out with some music, and we'll come right back. I do have another issue that we need to talk about, and it's a difficult one, but we'll talk about it when we come back. And it ties right in with some of this conversation as well. So we'll do that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk, normally with Regan, but today with Janene. So we'll be right back after this. My guest my guest co-host is Janene Yazzie. She is Danae. She's an activist, and she's a civil rights activist and a native rights activist. Lives on Navajo territory. I've had the pleasure of doing at least one event with you at the Left Forum, and you've joined me a number of times on my show. So I want to welcome you back to this show, to Let's Talk on WBAI, Janene Yazzie.
Yes, it's always a pleasure, John.
I remember when we did that first the first event. I'd never done an event like that at the Left Forum, and I remember when you came up, you said something like, "Wow, that's a tough act to follow," because when I get in front of a live crowd, especially, it's really easy to get worked up, and we have so many of these pressing issues, and there is this. We are in a constant identity crisis, and what we're talking about is some of that. This notion that leadership doesn't know where they stand. I mean, are we U.S. citizens, or are we Native peoples? And I even hesitate to say Native citizens, because even that, there's the legal terminology of some of this stuff that is imposed upon us: tribes, Indians, members, enrolled members. Some of this language, I did a whole show on the words we choose to use, and this, some of this stuff is very problematic, and it really cuts down to where we struggle with identity. I mean, it's why we oppose the mascot issue, because it's a theft of our identity and a mischaracterization of our identity, and we see it play out every day. Look, the United States still calls their agency the Bureau of Indian Affairs when they decided to step up and try to take some control over our gaming industries. They called it the National Indian Gaming Gaming Act. I mean, it's I'm sorry, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. I mean, they throw these words, ignoring the fact that more and more of our territories are actually moving away from the misnomers. I mean, whether it's myself as who oftentimes I have to introduce myself as Mohawk and then say, but that's not really our word. I'm Gunyagahaga, the people of the land of Flint. Whether we got to explain the language, the difference in the words Dene and Navajo. I mean, the fact that we have to do that still after all these years. I mean, I don't mind having that conversation, but it's sometimes frustrating when we still have to have the same old conversation with words like Indians and tribes and some of these other words that are imposed upon us.
Absolutely, because those terms were created at a time when our agency was completely erased or taken away. And I know, growing up as an Indigenous youth, the way that word was said to you and used to describe me never felt right. And in fact, it felt dirty and wrong in a lot of ways. And this is a lot of it wasn't until later with the mascot debate that they actually were able to collect data and do some research around the psychological impact of mascots on students. And I think that it's the type of impact that we have when we are mislabeled and when we are forced to identify and only be recognized by names and by terms for our nations that were given to us, but that don't actually reflect our real name for ourselves.
Well, and of course, this administration and others oftentimes find themselves in direct opposition to any viable research that talks about the damage that U.S. policies or things like the mascot issue. I mean, when you have climate change deniers and people want to deny what's happening with COVID-19, or they want to deny the psychological damage that is inflicted because of the mascot issue or any of the U.S. policies that have been imposed on Native people. I once wrote a poem that was about white men in black robes, and it throughout the poem, the point that I was trying to make, and I'm not going to read it here, but is that we were told we weren't quite human. That over and over again, that we weren't quite human, and that that was only through the work of these white men in black robes that we could join the humanity, and then we find ourselves in front of white men in black robes as judges saying, well, you're not those people anymore. We go through these generations of trauma trying to destroy us as a distinct people, and then we get it thrown in our face that we are no longer those distinct people. There's just a level of absurdity that goes right along with all of that.
Yep. No, absolutely. And this is all stuff that we have to reconcile with, and why we need such strong leadership with a critical analysis and understanding of our histories with colonization and the legacy of settler colonialism and the goals of the institutions, political, economic, and otherwise, of settler institutions, because we're still under attack. We're still having to defend ourselves and create enough space for us to actually articulate and exercise what self-determination looks like for our peoples, and that begins with restoring our identities.
Well, and it's hard to talk about self-determination when the federal government is like the final arbitrator on who our leadership is. They're the ones who place the crown on the head. They're the ones who will dictate whether our processes are legitimate enough for consideration. Not just through the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, where they tried to eliminate so-called traditional government, but we see it all the time in the way it plays out in terms of how do you access funds, and how the United States has reduced its obligation to Native people to the appearance of these gracious acts of charity, when most of these things are debts that the United States owes. And so, yeah, it's really tough. I know.
Absolutely. It doesn't even have to be like tribal elected leadership, but just people who control the departments and programs that are on our reservations. Yeah. Like the so-called government to government relationship, when the majority of, like, if some tribes are too small to have like their own tribal governance or their own tribal departments, then oftentimes those are BIA run.
Right.
Even my tribe where we do have our own 3-branch system, a lot of the quote unquote professionals and tribal employees that have been in these positions for decades, like, they are former BIA employees. So the government to government relationship, where when it means like federal and state representatives meeting with tribal governance and tribal government representatives, or our department heads, they're really still just talking to themselves and all of the leaders that they've approved of, who may not have an elected position but have strong ties through their professional careers and the ladders that they climb to get in the positions that they're in, that are conditioned to be aligned with the goals of the federal government anyway. And all of this, the consultations that are carried out, the way plans are developed for our lands, territories, and resources, the voices of the communities and the traditional leadership are not only absent, they're outright rejected by the agendas of those people who hold that power.
Well, and of course, I've done programs talking about the imbalance in influence over policy on Native territories, and how much is placed in the hands of white lawyers, white consultants, white lobbyists. I mean, all these people who again have stronger ties to state or federal governments, whether it's through the Bureau of Indian Affairs or otherwise. Or this is another one, and I'm even seeing it play out here in Seneca Nation. We see people who run for these offices, and they will tout their military experience as some sort of leadership experience. I'm literally listening to somebody run for council or for an executive position within a Native territory and say, well, I served as a battalion commander, so my leadership has been bona fides have been established through my place within the U.S. military. It's like, well, what the hell relationship could serving in the military play in terms of being able to lead, our own people, or be a leader in our own? I mean, that drives me crazy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The same thing is the same qualifications is extended to being a pastor, right? Like Vice President Lizer was a pastor and a business owner. Somehow those two things make him qualified to lead the Navajo Nation.
There you go.
And these are all just there's further evidence of the ways that our political systems are structured to further assimilate our peoples into Western ideologies.
It doesn't just accommodate indoctrination; it almost requires it, and so it's
absolutely.
All right, so there's one final topic, as I promised, that I want to talk about, and this one's a little tough because there's there was an execution that was conducted. I think where was it? Indiana or Illinois? I think yesterday. I think it was, and it was a Navajo person who had committed heinous acts against a grandmother and a child. I mean, and so I don't even want to talk about in any way, shape, or form the defense of his actions or the crime that was committed. But at the end of the day, this was a Navajo person who committed crimes against Navajo people on Navajo territory, and the Navajo Nation made it clear to the U.S. Justice Department that they opposed the death penalty. And even with these guys, the sycophantic leadership of the Navajo Nation, they could not convince or in any way, shape, or form affect the sentence that was imposed against this individual. They preferred a life imprisonment without parole. There was even a request of Donald Trump to commute his sentence to such, and for me, the issue isn't about what look. What this guy did was a terrible thing, and I don't even want to distinguish that the crime as something that warrants any kind of defense. But when we talk about sovereignty, when we talk about self-determination, when we talk about any of this stuff, and yet in this situation where where it's clear that the Navajo people have at least expressed through leadership and through some of other things that I've read, oppose the notion of a death penalty, even in this situation. I know there are plenty of people who are grateful that this guy is no longer can walk the planet, and I don't want to even get into that. But this is a political issue, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it is very complicated, and I appreciate the grace by which you're broaching the subject. And I think that for me, as a mother and as a Dene woman and a member of this big, great, beautiful nation,
Navajo Nation, you mean, by the way?
Dene Nation.
Yeah, there you go, Dene Nation. Yeah.
But one of the things that stood out to me was that it was the request of the mother of the young girl, who is also the daughter of the elderly woman, she's the one that made the request to not execute this gentleman. Mm-hmm. And I feel like in all of this too, what got overshadowed is what really justice means to our communities, and how these institutions do not reflect or do not have any way to accommodate the gravity of what that means and how to achieve it. What played out, I think, was really just a power play to demonstrate how it is by choice whether the federal government and its institutions wants to comply or uphold sovereignty or not. Yep. And it's an exercise that we see across so many issues that is really manipulative psychologically, but also disempowering in a very real political sense. And so I think that out of the conflict and everything that has happened, this should serve as a wake-up call for people on whatever side of the fence they are with this administration or with the RNC and DNC, to really wake up and see that this attack against our sovereignty and against our peoples is part of the structure as a whole, and that our systems of governance, of reconciliation, of restorative justice, of building alternative sustainable economies fundamentally conflict and cannot fit into those structures as they are.
Well, and this whole thing became symbolic, and obviously you have a Trump administration that is, trying to pitch themselves as the law and order, administration. There's been a bit of a moratorium on executions that the Trump administration has done everything they could to lift that, and indeed has lifted. And it should be noted that this is historic. This is the first time in American history that a Native person was executed for committing a crime against against Native people on Native territory. So this is, and they've executed plenty of Native people, but never have they executed a Native person for committing a crime against the Native people on Native territory. This is actually a first,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a country meaning the United States is a country that doesn't hesitate to kill Native people, and they never have. So it does stand as something worth noting that this still does represent a first. And you're right. I mean, when to ignore the wishes of a mother, to ignore the wishes of the Navajo people in terms of the position that they have taken on the death penalty, to ignore all of that just so you could advance your tough on crime agenda is it's sickening. And again, considering the fact that both Lizer and Nez were both sucking up to the Democrats and the Republicans and still couldn't get any consideration on this thing. And look, this is just another example of exactly what you were saying, how any attempt that we have in real self-determination is always going to be undermined and meted out by the federal government. And that's where we sit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I mean, this is again, I'm not sitting here mourning the death of this murderer, but I will say that when you consider what was really at play here, it's just another example of the colonial state, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
I've often we hear conversations like decolonization all the time, but some of the people who will tout that word, that term, that expression, do so as if for them decolonization is just finding a comfortable place within the colonial structures. They aren't considering this notion that we need to untangle ourselves from those systems of oppression and assert our right to create our own systems of conflict resolution, of restorative justice, and of governance, all of that stuff. And we are severely plagued by that. And as you mentioned earlier, the role the church has played, the role the military enlistment has played, the role of this notion of patriotism and allegiance to the United States has really clouded the judgment of many people, and most of all, the leadership that is recognized by the federal government. No coincidence there. It clouds the judgment.
Absolutely. And it really indoctrinates them into this idea that you have to play within the system in order to enact meaningful change outside of it. And also another thing that we were talking about on your other show, about sort of framing the vision for true self-determination, true sovereignty, however you want to define it, as unrealistic and naive.
Yeah.
And I think that's been one of the major hindrances in building unity within the tribal nations and across indigenous communities.
Right. And that's exactly it. I mean, when we suggest that we have the right to assert nationhood or statehood in the international context, we're looked at as if this is an absurd proposition. And as I mentioned before, in previous conversations, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples stays way clear of the notion that among the rights of indigenous peoples is to assert ourselves as distinct governments in the statehood context of the word. They talk about us being able to assert self-determination, but even that gets muddled up between the United States saying, well, when we say self-determination, we mean internal self-determination. But the international definition is often tied to statehood. Janene, I want to thank you so much for joining me again. And we didn't just have you back so we could check the box. Okay, we've had enough Janene for this year. No, I want to have you back. You've been not just a great guest, but a great co-host today. So I want to thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have these critical conversations with someone that thinks just as deeply about the issues that we're facing as a whole.
I'm always prepared for people who don't agree with me, but It's always a pleasant surprise when I have people who do. so thank you so much. Hey, look, if you're listening to us on WBAI, you can still catch us our shows on podcasts. You can search Let's Talk Native with John Kane podcast, and you can find our WBAI show as well as our Let's Talk Native shows. And of course, I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV, for videos of our programs and our short form videos as well. This is John Kane for Let's Talk Yahweh.